Good morning to everyone. As a teenager, I was first daughter in a family of 8 souls. My younger sister and I were therefore naturally drafted to help the family. Both of our parents had full-time jobs. Dad was a plastic extrusion worker, reed plastic bags for turkeys and beef. And my mother was a nurse. No sympathy for any sore throat or sniffles. My 3 brothers and younger sister were so much younger that they were not useful in helping with any of the chores, except to be making messes. And so Joan and I were the go-to persons, and we helped to keep the system running somewhat smoothly. Joan and I would shift loads of wet laundry from one wash tub to the other. We would dust and vacuum each Saturday. We would change the bedding and wash the dishes after dinner. I confess I was not one of the most gracious of aides. I did many things with resentment. As we moved on to high school and got older, we learned to cook. We didn't do as well as my mother did, of course, but one summer Dad worked the shift from 3 to 11, and so Joan and I were charged with cooking him lunch. It was the one hot meal he would get a day. How did we learn to cook, you might ask, and maybe not ask, but anyway, I learned from the Bible of all beginner cooks, Betty Crocker. Everything was laid out step by step, flour to liquid, and well, you could always have a recipe that produced a tasty meal if you followed the recipe. And the only thing that my dad insisted on was that the food did not flinch when he stuck his fork in it, which is pretty low standards when you think about it. But when you have 2 teenagers cooking for you, maybe your expectations aren't that high. And, you know, we were not that good, but after a period of time, we got bored. And then we got creative. Once we combined 2 recipes, and we got a suspicious looking dish that was spicy and yet gray. But Dad ate it with no complaint, which really should be put up for sainthood somewhere, I'm sure. But we learned in our cooking experiments that it was best to taste test your way through the dish. It's a great way to see if you're making progress and if it's going to be edible when you get through, because you're going to be the first one to eat it. And one thing we know for sure, anyone who's been cooked a dish at all, is if you put too much salt in it, it makes it just about inedible. You can try to recover from too much salt, but the dish gets bigger because you have to add more ingredients, and it just gets, and it gets unwieldy, and then it doesn't taste the same when it's in the right combinations. And the bad thing is that we all have to sit down at the table and you have to listen to the griping. And my family griped a lot. It was just intimidating. So we didn't usually do the supper meals, but you were much more careful. So we're on the subject of salt. And Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth." You are the salt of the earth. It's not because we're naturally salty. There's not natural saltiness within us, or that we are working to become salt. He says we already are. And he's talking, I think, more about isness than it is about doing something or seeking something. And so I want to ask Jesus, how does that work? How does one's saltiness that we seem we already are, how does that go out into the world? How does that enfold our lives? When we lived up north, salt is very common. When the winters drag on for months and months, they throw a lot of salt and sand around all over the roads. Northerners spend the whole summer piling up towers of salt to throw around on the ground, come any ice or snowstorm. You could almost say salt is a throwaway, a commodity. But lives are saved by salt in the right place at the right time. When you come to church dinners, as we're going to have one after the service today, you know that if a cook puts just a little bit more salt in a dish, a lot of times it will be all that much better. Because the whole dish as a group, as a meal, enhances and blends into something new. Salt in Jesus's day was precious. Salt could be part of a man's wages. Salt kept food from rotting. And the Romans believed that salt was one of the purest of things there could be in the world, because it was formed from sun and the sea. Sea salt, we call it. Salt kept a person from dying of dehydration if you lived in the desert. What Jesus was saying that day is that his followers are expected to act naturally in ways that are important and very, very variety, as in this world as salt does, and to do it all for the sake of God. As salt preserves, disciples are to preserve the goodness of life, truth and kindness in speech, patience and forgiveness in relationships. As salt heals wounds, Jesus' disciples promote healing through prayer, caring for the lost and lonely, the hungry and the homeless. As a cleansing agent, we, the salty ones, witness for the good that is found in God and model God's values in the world. There is another agent in the world in Jesus' day. It was used in food. It's very common for us today also. It's pepper. Jesus did not, and does not ask us to behave like the pepper of the earth. If you think about it, pepper calls attention to itself. Pepper burns and bites on the tongue and in the belly. Christians are not meant to be pepper people. Salty, that's our role. When distributed properly, everything blends together and everything else is more richly flavored. But Jesus does not expect us to call attention to ourselves. Instead, we make others more acceptable, events more meaningful, and the whole dish of life more loving. We should note that Jesus' revelation that we are the salt of the world appears in scriptures immediately after the delivery of the Beatitudes. The blessed art thou who do so. We can therefore infer there's a connection between those Beatitudes and what Jesus tells us about salt. There's a connection because if we think of the values of peacemaking, mercy showing, and persecution bearing, those are three virtues in which our salt can go out to the world. But don't forget the other three. Our mourning, our innocence of heart, and our deep hunger for the presence of God. That's to be blessed too. The three virtues of inner, the three last verses are about our inner life. They're internally renovating so that our offerings are meant inside and out to transform the world. And that's what God's all about, isn't it? Transforming the world. We have committed ourselves as we follow Jesus to be part of that process, salting. Now, I've been going on kind of heavy about salt and Jesus's ministry, God's love for creation, and where any one of us is in our spiritual life, salty or peppery or otherwise. So I'd like to add another point, probably digressing off to the side. Father Nick always leaves me when I come to one of his sermons with some awesome insight and then a question that I go home with and I ponder. And he does it just before he steps down from the pulpit, if you've noticed. I love his sermons, but mine aren't his sermons. I would like to ask something, maybe something tasty to chew upon for you. While we're out in the world, sprinkling grains of flavorness around, can we be joyful? Lent is coming, and it's a somber season, and each season should be observed as needed. But Jesus said, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And how does that come about, Lord? So it came to me, why not seek out the joy in our journey as we carry our pockets full of salt? I believe Jesus in his time here on earth was filled with joy. I believe he attracted people to him, not because of his beautiful face that we see in the pictures, but because, well, his insights into God and his teaching of God, who loves each and every one of us and never leaves us alone, and his open questions, which lead us forward to search for the goodness in this life. All of those things, yes. But also, I believe Jesus smiled a lot. I believe he smiled all the time. His eyes must have twinkled when he saw Zacchaeus up in a tree. And his lips, I think his lips were not turned down as sour when the rich young man came and said, I want more. I think he smiled. And I think he really saw the joke with Nathanael, who said, his friend said, I found the Lord. He's a teacher from Nazareth. And he says, can anything good come out of Nazareth? That was a joke. I don't think many of his jokes got recorded in the scriptures. I think there were a lot of them, though. Jesus must have laughed all the time when he worked with his hands when he smoothed the wood, when he flowed over with joy when he interacted with people. Can we be like Jesus? We can be salty. That's what he says we are. But can we laugh and smile at each other, at strangers on the street? They may think you're doing something suspicious, but he enjoyed people. He enjoys us now. Perhaps the salt, the true salt of the earth, is laughter. And what a great seasoning laughter is for the world. We probably need it a lot nowadays, don't we? Amen.